Okay, great. I have confirmation that somebody can hear and see me. So welcome to the second webinar of the Google Apps for Education 101 webinar series. Today we'll be focusing on Google Apps for Education deployment. So we'll be covering the A to Z of a Google Apps deployment. My name is Ariel Hathaway, and I'm a member of the Google Apps for Education team. So let's take a look at our agenda for today's webinar. Sorry, just 1 second. Okay. So there are 6 basic steps to Google Apps deployment. 1 will be your rollout plan. The second will be provisioning users. The third will be migration of data. 4 is authentication. 5 is develop and integrate. And 6 is data liberation and transition to Alumni Account. We'll be covering each of these in more detail. So your rollout plan consists of 4 main aspects: the timeline for your deployment and the type of deployment, mail routing and architecture, choosing a domain name and multiple domain management, organizational units, and policies. So let's start by talking about the first 2. So the timeline for deployment and type of deployment are 2 very important subjects that you need to think about before you start your Google Apps deployment. The timeline has to do with, will you be doing this over the course of 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks, a longer period? That will largely depend on the size of your school and also any change management that you need to do in terms of training on the side of your faculty and staff, or getting various things ready, such as migration tools, things of that nature. Additionally, the type of deployment is important. We see generally 3 types of deployment. 1 would be what's known as a big bang deployment. A big bang deployment means that schools are going to roll out to everyone at one time. So, for example, you would say on a certain date, on April 15th, which is tax day, I'm going to have all of my users using Google Apps from this day forward. You may turn off access to your old server, and also you may, you're likely going to change your mail so it's just routing to Google at that point in time and not routing back to your old server. The second type of launch we will see is known as an opt-in launch. So an opt-in launch works by people can opt into using the service. Typically, there's a date further in the future that you may say after this date, so maybe after June 15th, something of that sort, you're going to have everyone on Google Apps. However, up until that date, you're going to let people opt into when they want to switch. And this can be done with our provisioning toolkit. So users can give some of their information. This would be set up on your side, but then it can work with our provisioning API to create the account on our end. One other thing that's important to note here is that when you're doing an opt-in, you could technically provision all of the accounts beforehand and then just give users their login credentials once they opt into using the account and change their mail routing depending on how you're doing that. And then the third type of launch that we'll see is what we call a phased launch. So phased launch is typically done by maybe moving department by department or grade by grade, depending on if you're in a higher education institution or a K-12 institution. So this may be done so that way you can get Google gurus in certain departments. So say, for example, I have the economics department go onto Google Apps first. They can really get to know the product, and then when I have the political science department that may be housed in the same building, they're going to be able to leverage that knowledge from the economics department. So that's the third type of launch that we see. So the type of launch is very important because this is going to affect what you choose to do for mail routing. So for mail routing, let's just take a quick look at the next slide. So for mail routing, when we talk about mail routing, we're talking about where is your mail going to go. Your mail is going to go wherever MX records are telling it to go. So, for example, if your MX records are pointing to your on-campus server, then your mail is going to flow to your on-campus server. If you have your MX records pointing to Google, then the mail is going to flow straight to Google. So this is important because depending on the type of launch that you choose, you're going to have to route your mail differently. If you're doing a big bang launch and switching your MX records to point to Google, then that will be the only thing you need to do. You'll switch your MX records to point to Google, mail will flow to Google, and all mail will reach the users who are provisioned within Google Apps. However, if you're doing some sort of phase launch or opt-in process, then you do need to think more about your mail architecture. You'll be doing either dual or split delivery through your legacy server or through Google Apps. Let's talk about each of these. So dual delivery through your legacy server, and your MX records would still point to your legacy server, and from there, once the mail hits your legacy server, you would set up a forward. So you could have a domain such as g.yourschoolname.edu with MX records that point to Google. And for a user, when an email hits their legacy inbox, it would also forward to this alias. And then it would go into Google Apps. So this is something that you would add in your Google Apps account. If you were doing split delivery, then you would need some sort of mailer table on your side. So you could say, for example, John Smith has an account that's provisioned on our legacy server. We're going to send his mail straight there. Ariel, for example, has an account that's on Google Apps, so we're going to send her mail straight to Google Apps. But it would still go into your onto your campus routing first. The second way to do this is through Google Apps. So when you're doing mail routing through Google Apps, you would change your MX records to point to Google Apps, and then from there, within the control panel, you would set it to route email for, if it's for dual delivery, you would say for all accounts, and if it's split delivery, you would say for unprovisioned accounts. There you would specify the server name that you're routing mail to, and then the mail that is corresponding to whether you've selected unprovisioned or all accounts would be routed to your legacy server. One important consideration to make, too, when you're figuring out this, if you are doing an opt-in or phased launch, is how your legacy server is going to treat mail. For example, if you have this John Smith who's on your legacy server and sends to me who's on Google Apps, but we have the same domain name, you need to be sure that your legacy server is actually going to query the DNS so that that way it actually is going out to the internet. Some servers will actually hold it into the local environment, and when it doesn't see my account existing on the local environment, it may just bounce that message. So that's one important consideration to make. So choosing domain names. I talked a little bit about a subdomain before, but just choosing your primary domain name for your Google Apps account is extremely important. This is going to be something that's going to be what users are logging in with, what they're going to in terms of branding, how your sites are branded, things of that nature. So it's important to select this how you want it to be from the beginning. So your primary domain name will be the primary domain name associated with your Google Apps account. This is how users are going to log in, and they can also have nicknames, things of that sort, but this is going to be the primary username of a user. Additionally, you have the ability to add domain aliases. So if you're doing something like dual delivery to your legacy server, you would have a domain alias, like I said, such as g.schoolname.edu, with MX records that point to Google Apps. You could also do this for mascot.school.edu, anything of that sort. It's going to allow users to receive email at this additional email address. Additionally, you have the ability to add multiple domain management, or multiple domains within one Google Apps control panel. When you do this, you can have a user with the same name that's actually two separate entities. So you can have a John Smith at school.edu and a John Smith at alumni.school.edu. And those are going to be two separate things. So additionally, a part of your rollout plan is going to be taking into consideration organizational units. So organizational units was released in the summer of 2010 within Google Apps and allows you to basically sort people into different organizations. This is an example of more of a K-12 situation, but we do see this commonly in the higher education space as well. So as you can see here, so that you have faculty staff, which is then divided into English teachers and science teachers, and then lower school, first graders and second graders, and then the upper school, ninth graders and seventh graders. So this helps you in order to organize various things. You can help to organize your classes or your students into various classes. the class of 2011, the class of 2012. So just from an organizational perspective, it can help in terms of making sure that you're able to quickly tell where a user is going to be. Additionally, it allows for services to be turned on or off. So in some instances, what we'll see is that you may be turning on all services for your students at the beginning, or vice versa for your faculty and staff, but you may only want some services turned on for the other group of users. So you can turn on or off certain services. So in this case, Contacts is turned on, but Gmail and Calendar are turned off, and then Google Docs is turned on. So you're able to say, I want this group of users to have these services, but I don't want this other group of users to have these services. So this is one really useful aspect and something that you want to take into consideration beforehand so that way you can provision your users correctly. So provisioning users. So there are three main ways to provision users. One is with a CSV upload. A CSV upload entails you put together a CSV file of it has your username, first name, last name, and password for the user. And then you'll upload this via your control panel, your Google Apps control panel. This will create users. This is typically done for smaller schools, however, as it's limited to 500 users in one file. You can upload more users the same way, but you need to wait for one file to be processed before you begin the next upload. So that's just an important thing to know. We see this typically used in smaller schools, but with larger schools, we'll see them use either the Google Apps Directory Sync tool or the Provisioning API. Let me go into a bit more detail about each of those tools. Both the Provisioning API and Google Apps Directory Sync can be used to provision users within Google Apps. For example, if I want to create a group of, say, 5,000 users, I can use either of these tools. The Provisioning API is scripted, so it's something that you would script on your end. Then it can read from either your LDAP, something else, a file that you provide it with, and then programmatically push that information into Google Apps. This is really useful if you want to create users on the fly, if you want to change user passwords on the fly, things of that sort. But it does require scripting knowledge, and since it requires scripting knowledge, it can be more of a time investment. The Google Apps Directory Sync tool works similarly to the Provisioning API. However, it's a graphical user interface. So it'll guide you through, and it's a tool provided by Google. So you install that on a client machine, and then you access your LDAP via that. And it's a read-only, one-way sync from your LDAP to Google Apps. So basically what it does is it will compare what's in your LDAP to what's in Google Apps and generate a change report. So if a user appears in your LDAP but doesn't appear in Google Apps, it will create that user in Google Apps. If a user doesn't appear in your LDAP but it does appear in Google Apps, it's going to delete that user or suspend that user. Just as a quick side note, I typically do recommend that schools choose to suspend users instead of deleting users, just because it's a lot easier from the perspective of the school to unsuspend users if they're accidentally suspended than undelete users. So the Google Apps Directory Sync tool has much of the functionality of the Provisioning API, a little bit less flexibility in terms of what you're doing. You can't push things on the fly. You have to wait for a sync to run. We typically see schools will do this on a regular basis, such as every night, every week. That's dependent on how frequently you're seeing changes occur in your LDAP, things of that nature. Another important note to make is that with certain directories or certain LDAP systems, the passwords are stored in a proprietary format for that directory. The passwords that you can sync to Google Apps have to be stored in SHA-1, MD5, or plain text. So that's just one important note to make when you're deciding how you're going to be, if you're going to be syncing passwords, and if not, how you'll be dealing with that. So then the Provisioning API and Google Apps Directory Sync tool, it also allows you to manage organizational structure. So you can move people between organizations, things of that sort. So this is just a screenshot of what the Google Apps Directory Sync tool looks like. So it will map user details to Google Apps from your LDAP. So what you do is you create queries. So you would say, I want to find everyone in my LDAP that matches this criteria, and then it will check that against the Google Apps users that are in there. So on the left-hand side, you can see what it would look like in Google Apps. And then on the right-hand side, that's what it looks like in your LDAP. Just one other aside about the Google Apps Directory Sync tool. is that the Google Apps Directory Sync tool can also be used to sync shared contacts. So if you have contacts that aren't in your domain or users that you're not yet provisioning in Google Apps, you can sync them with the Google Apps Directory Sync tool. It can also be used to sync profile information. So if you have additional information about users in your LDAP that you want to sync to the contact functionality within Google Apps, you can do that. Additionally, you can do this with APIs. However, it's a shared contact API and then a user profiles API. So that's just an important note. One other thing is that you can also provision groups with both the provisioning API and with the Google Apps Directory Sync tool. So if you have mailing lists, things of that nature, you can sync them to the group service within Google Apps. Migration of data. This is a pretty popular topic with schools. More recently, we've seen schools that may opt not to migrate their data for their students, but will typically migrate data for their faculty and staff. There are various migration tools that we offer, so we'll talk a little bit about each of these and how you can leverage them at your institution. Client-side migration tools. So a client-side migration tool is a migration tool that the user is going to be able to run on their own. So this is something that they can run on their own and choose to migrate their own data. We offer a tool, Google Apps Migration for Microsoft Outlook, that will allow users to migrate data, mail calendar, and contact data from Microsoft Outlook. We also have tools that will allow you to migrate from Apple Mail clients, and then Mail Fetcher, which is a POP-based tool that as long as the server has POP enabled on it and that you're migrating from, users can basically put in information and pop the mail from their inbox on that server into their current Google Apps account. So these are typically what we'll see schools recommend to their students and sometimes to faculty and staff. But it is a bit more common for server-side migrations to be done for faculty and staff. So a server-side migration is something that the IT staff at your school is going to run. So this is going to involve a little bit more work from the perspective of the IT staff. However, it's going to make sure that everyone's data is migrated, not just people who opt in to have their data migrated. So we have Google Apps Migration for Microsoft Exchange. This will allow you to migrate mail, calendar, and contact data from an Exchange server. Additionally, there's an IMAP component of this tool. The IMAP component of the Exchange migration tool will migrate from servers that aren't just Exchange. So the name is a little bit misleading, but just to reiterate, you can use the Google Apps Migration for Microsoft Exchange tools. The IMAP portion of that can be used for other IMAP servers, such as GroupWise. Additionally, we have a Google Apps Migration for Lotus Notes. So if you are using Lotus Notes, you can use that tool to migrate data from Lotus Notes. Additionally, there are programmatic ways to migrate data. So for an IMAP migration, for example, that's only going to migrate your email data. Your calendar and contact data wouldn't be migrated. A lot of times we'll see that schools will opt to have people migrate this data on their own, but if you do want to migrate the calendar and contact data for your users, you can use one of our APIs to do so. We have calendar, contacts, documents, mail, and site APIs. So these are all available to you with the Google Apps Suite, so that way you can use these in order to migrate any data that you want to. Authentication. Authentication is always a popular topic with schools. So there are a few different ways to do authentication. One is default Google authentication. This means that when a user goes to log in, they're going to be presented with the Google Apps sign-in for a domain, and they'll enter their username and password, and then will log into the account. As a domain administrator, you can opt into two-step authentication for your users. So you can say, I want users to be able to elect for two-step verification. But however, this is not going to be mandated for your users. But if a user opts into it, then they would need to also enter a code from their mobile device in addition to their password that they entered. When you're authenticating straight to Google, you need to have a password stored within Google Apps. You're authenticating straight to Google Apps servers, so you need a password just in order to authenticate. With single sign-on, the way that single sign-on works is that we support a SAML version 2.0 single sign-on service. So the way that this works is that a user can authenticate through a login page that you specify, and then their authentication token will be sent to us. So you don't have to have a password stored in Google Apps. Basically, you can just send the authentication, which username it's supposed to go along with, and it will authenticate to us. And with single sign-on, you can use this to integrate with your portal, things of that sort. So say a user could log into your portal, you could have a link to mail, and then the user could click on that link, not have to enter their password again. Additionally, one thing to take into account is that some users are going to probably want a password stored within Google Apps. Because if they want to access via mail client or mobile device, they are going to have a password stored within Google Apps. If they want a password to be stored within Google, if you want users to have a password stored within Google Apps, you either need to sync passwords with Google Apps, or you need to use something like the provisioning API to push passwords. It can either be the same password or separate password when the user changes their LDAP password to Google Apps. Sorry. And then finally, OAuth Federation. So OAuth Federation allows for third-party websites and applications and log in using their Google credentials. So this is just another means of accessing and can be something that you grant to various applications. So accessing anywhere. Once you've deployed Google Apps, you want your users to have the ability to access when they're mobile. So in order to help with this, we offer device management, so remote password rights, password rules, etc., that can be set up through the Google Apps control panel to ensure that users are maintaining their devices in a way that will keep their data secure. So, and then when you're on a mobile device, you can access via the client or the browser to access your mail. So as I stated before, single sign-on will work with browser-based access, but won't work with a mail client-based access, unless they have a password stored in Google Apps. And when they're accessing anywhere, there are various types of syncs. So people can sync their mail, calendar, contacts, and how the sync works is going to depend on what type of phone they're using. Sync is going to work differently on an iPhone than it does on an Android, for example. Developing and integrating. In terms of developing and integrating, we offer a variety of APIs. We understand that Google Apps is just a small part of the IT infrastructure at your school, and because of this, we have APIs that allow for integration with various existing institutional applications and systems. OAuth is the enabler for these. And just one thing that's important to note is these are all open source APIs. They allow you to get data into Google, but you can also use them to get data out of Google. In the event that you want to put it into a portal, you want to build some tools that are pulling data from Google Apps, you can do this as well. And there are APIs for most services in the Google Apps suite. Let's take a look at a few. Contextual Gadgets. So contextual Gmail gadgets will work by, basically you can create a gadget that will look for some sort of contextual information in a Gmail message, and then we'll put a little gadget at the bottom of that message. Say, for example, you send out an email to your students at the end of a semester advertising a course that's being taught next semester. You could have a contextual gadget that would allow them that would work with your registration system, and with the click of a button, they would be registered for that course. For real-time notifications via XMPP and Google Talk, you can get notifications of when somebody updated something, when somebody is ready to talk to you, things of that nature. So this could be programmed so that we are Professor could hold virtual office hours. Additionally, you could use this to make calendar sidebar information. This could integrate with your learning management system and put due dates for a student within their calendar in the sidebar. So that way they would know upcoming events. So here's an example of an RSmart integration with Google Docs and Sakai. So So basically what this is doing is it's using the collaborative functionality of Google Docs and then the learning management aspect of Sakai. So the way this could be really useful, so say you have teaching assistants who are writing an exam for a course, they can use this to write the exam, collaborate on the exam. They don't have to ever leave their rooms. They can just be working in their rooms. And then they can use the Sakai functionality of the learning management system to release the exam at a certain time, to say that students are allowed to access the exam for a certain amount of time, and things of that sort. So let's talk a bit about transitioning to Alumni Account. So when you're transitioning to Alumni Account, you have a few considerations to make. One, are you going to keep your users on the same Google Apps account, the same Google Apps domain, after they graduate? If you're opting to do this, then you can move them to a separate organization. With this organization, you can turn off some of the services if you don't want them to have access to anything while still leaving a few of the services on. Another way to approach this would say, I'm going to allow users to keep an account, but it's going to be on a separate domain, a separate Google Apps domain. So it's going to be a separate Google Apps account that's managed separately from your primary Google Apps account. If you do this, then people are going to need a way to migrate their data. And with data liberation, this can be done with the various tools that are outlined on this. So it's dataliberation.org. This outlines a variety of tools that can help you migrate your data from different Google Apps services to either out of Google Apps or to a separate Gmail account, things of that nature. If you also decided that you didn't want users to have an account at all, they could use the data liberation information in order to export to a consumer Gmail account. One other approach would be within the same Google Apps control panel, you could create an additional domain for alumni.school4edu.edu, for example. With this, you could have, again, johnsmith@alumni.school.edu, which is a separate user than johnsmith@school.edu. So that's just one other thing to take into consideration. Then configuring forwarding. Another way to approach this would be to configure forwarding, or maybe students are going to primarily use another account after they graduate. So forwarding can be set either through the admin control panel or through user settings. The email settings API will also allow you to set user forwarding. So we'll go through a couple of sample deployments. So I have a sample deployment for a small school and then a sample deployment for a large school. So a sample deployment for a small school. The rollout plan will be a big bang switch for faculty and students with a 6-week implementation time. There'll be a faculty.school.edu and students.school.edu domain. They'll be using multiple domain management, so it'll be within the same control panel, but it will be 2 separate domains. There'll also be various faculty and student organizations. Faculty and student organizations for the different departments, and then student organizations for the different class years. User provisioning will be done with a CSV file. There are about 1,000 users at this school, so that'll be 2 CSV files, but we won't have to break it up into too many files. Data migration will be done via the server side for some faculty. So in order to do this, in order to see who wants their data migrated, some of the ways that we've seen this done is that you might create a Google form and have people opt into having their data migrated. Then you can use the information that they provide in order to populate the CSV file that you're feeding to the migration tool. In terms of authentication, we'll be authenticating straight to Google, which means that we'll be, with a CSV file, we'll be uploading a password. That will be the user's Google Apps password. For mail routing, we'll be switching MX records straight to Google. So after that cutover date, the MX will be switched to Google, and everyone's mail will be sent straight to Google. Let's take a look at what it might look like at a large school. So we'll be doing a phase, students first, then faculty, with faculty and student organizations. Typically, when we see a phase launch, so we'll be doing students, and then we may be doing faculty department by department. This can sometimes it'll take 2 months, sometimes it will take 6 months. This really depends on your institution. In terms of user provisioning, we'll be using the directory sync with Active Directory. Active Directory is an example of a directory that stores passwords in a format that's not SHA-1, MD5, or plain text. So in order to do this, there is an additional step that you would have to take in order to either change your passwords, capture passwords in a SHA-1 format and store in a different attribute, or you'd want to have users select new passwords that are going to be used within Google Apps. For data migration, we'll be doing a server-side migration for all faculty and for some students. So we'll have students opt into this migration process, but we're going to assume that all of our faculty want data migrated. For authentication, we'll be doing a single sign-on integration with Active Directory and our LMS. So this means that we're going to have users log into one place. They'll be able to access both their LMS services and the Google Apps services. We think that that will lead to better adoption. And then in terms of mail routing, we'll be doing split delivery through our legacy server. So when we do split delivery through our legacy server, we'll be routing mail to our legacy server, and then for certain accounts, we'll be putting straight to Google Apps, and then other accounts will be going to their account on the legacy server, depending on where we are in the phase. So now I have some deployment frequently asked questions. So one question that we often get are, what are the differences between groups, organizations, alternate domain, and domain aliases? They all kind of start to blend together if you aren't super familiar with them. So a group is going to be used as more of a mailing list. It can also be used to grant permission to documents and calendars, things of that nature, but it's going to contain a bunch of email addresses, and is going to have an email address associated with it. So you may have a Computer Science 101 group, for example. An organization, on the other hand, is more just it's for the service on us functionality and also for the, and also for the organization of your Google Apps control panel. So you may use this to say students, faculty, staff, but at this time you can't use that to say grant permission to this group of students in order to do this. You need to use a group for that. So alternate domains. So alternate domains are going to be additional domains that you provision within your Google Apps control panel. So for example, this is going to be something like medschool.school.edu. That might be, we're going to have different users provisioned there than we do in our primary domain, and we may have some users that have the similar usernames, but they're not the same person. A domain alias, on the other hand, is something that everyone can receive mail at. So I have my schoolname.edu, and then I have my mascot, which is a turkey. So I have turkeys.school.edu. I want everyone to be able to receive mail sent to both of those email addresses. This is also very useful when you're configuring delivery through your legacy server, dual delivery through your legacy server, because you can change the MX records of that domain alias, and then all users can receive mail into their Google Apps account. Another question that commonly comes up is, should I migrate data for my users? So in the recent past, we've seen schools carefully evaluating this. I think that when people first started migrating to Google Apps, it was more common for people to say, I'm going to migrate all of my data. But we've seen schools carefully evaluating this based on whether or not they think that people are going to want their data migrated. And we've seen many that may opt to migrate data for faculty and staff, but have decided to let students decide whether they're going to migrate their own data. Some students, or some faculty and staff, for example, may think that it's better to start with a clean slate, and not migrating your data can help to reduce the deployment time that's necessary. Okay, on to the next one. How can I add contact objects from our legacy mail environment to Google Apps? So I mentioned this briefly before, but say, for example, you have contact objects for another school and for people who aren't yet provisioning Google Apps, and you want to add these to your Google Apps account. You can do this by using either the Shared Contacts API or the Directory Sync tool. Both of these provide the functionality to sync contact objects that aren't going to be user accounts within Google Apps. should I implement single sign-on? This is a decision that's going to be based on what is best for your institution, but single sign-on will allow users to authenticate to Google and to other services. So that way they can only have to think about one login when they're logging into various services. With single sign-on, passwords are going to be the same that they are for, say, your portal and for Google Apps, so that means the user only has to remember one password, which can be a little bit easier in terms of remembering various things if you're not choosing to sync your passwords with Google Apps. But it is one of the more technically complicated components of a Google Apps deployment. So if you are interested in doing this, you will need a technical team on your side that's able to implement. Otherwise, we do recommend contacting a Google Apps partner who can help you implement single sign-on. One other common thing that we see is somebody will go to register their domain, and they will say, this domain already has a Google Apps account. So you might ask, why am I being told that my domain is already registered? So if you're seeing this message, what is likely is that there may already be a Team Edition Google Apps account that's associated with your domain. A Team Edition Google Apps account allowed users to basically, if they had an email address, so if they have internationalwildcats.org, and that's not a Google Apps account, they could sign up for a Team Edition account, which would allow them to use the collaborative functionality of Google Apps without actually having a Google Apps account. So they could use Docs, they could use Calendar, and they could share easily with other people who have a Team Edition account on the same domain. So these are quite common for many institutions. So if you do see this, then basically what you can do is you can go to that login page for that Team Edition account, which is just going to be www.google.com/a/your domain name, and you can then create an account there. If you're the administrator, if you want to be the administrator of that domain, there's a process that you can go through. So you can click I'm the administrator, and then you can verify domain ownership, and then you'll be granted, it will be changed into an account that's a standard edition account, which then you can have upgraded to Education Edition. Another common question that arises is, how can users integrate their Google Apps accounts with their existing Gmail account? When schools implement, a number of times they have students who already have existing Gmail accounts, and they want to be able to integrate these with their Google Apps accounts. So there are various Help Center articles that we have regarding how to migrate data between Google accounts. So they can do this. So they can export their contacts from one account and import it into another. Additionally, if they wanted to, they could set up forwarding or mail fetcher to make sure that mail that arrives in one account is going to be transferred to the other account. That way they can have a one-stop shop, one account where they go to check everything. So another question that comes up a lot is, how can you block password changes? So some people may be authenticating, having their users authenticate straight to Google Apps, but they may be doing an LDAP sync on a nightly basis or a weekly basis. And because of that, they want users to change their password in the LDAP, not in Google Apps. Because if they change it in Google Apps, then it could potentially get out of sync with what's in the LDAP until the next time the LDAP sync occurs. And then when that LDAP sync occurs, the user could be a bit confused. So one way to do this is within the Google Apps control panel. If you go to Advanced Settings and the Set Up Single Sign-On configuration, if you populate the change password URL with a link to whatever you want to point users to, this is the link that users are going to see when they go to change their password within Google Apps. So this is really useful because you can populate this link to a web page that says, please do not change your password this way. Please go through the regular change password process for your LDAP if they know what that is. You could just say, please don't change your password this way. That's up to you, but you can stop users from changing their password within Google Apps if you do want to make sure that they're kept in sync with your LDAP. Okay, so let's open it up for some questions. I think there are some questions that are already here, so let me take a look, and then feel free to send any other questions along. And one thing is, so we will be posting the recordings of this webinar series as we work through them, so these will be posted on YouTube, and we'll be sending out the links to this. So it looks like there's a question about single sign-on and Picasa. So this is something that, and if users are opening Picasa, it looks like if they're opening it for the first time, it will ask for a Google Apps password. So one thing that I would check on with this is that if users are already authenticated to Google Apps and they're selecting Picasa, then that should log them in. However, if you see that this is not working, what I would recommend doing is creating a support ticket through your control panel. So there's a support tab. You can provide the details there, and then somebody on our support team will be able to take a look at it. Also, there's an API support forum. So there is a SSO API support forum that can help you if you are having an issue with your SSO. As far as I know, that I don't know if that's off the top of my head, I haven't heard that occurring frequently. So I don't think that it's an issue that may be widespread, but we can definitely, you could definitely look into that. Okay, so somebody asked, what are the possibilities with Google Apps for education environment and post-uni services? So for Google Apps for Education, if you're a K-12 institution, you will get Google Message Security at no additional cost, so it is free. And for higher education institutions, it's a 66% discount off the list price. So with Google Apps for Education and post-uni services, for K-12, you would have the integrated version of post-uni. So with the integrated version of post-uni, it's going to sync your users from Google Apps into the post-uni interface. If you have the standalone version, which would be what a higher ed institution would have, you have the ability to route mail with that. So you can, if all mail is flowing to post-uni, basically you can say that I'm going to send mail to this user to this place, and I'm going to send mail to this user to this place. So you create different, they're known as email config, and an email config can then be set to a certain way. So when you're using Postini, you are changing our MX records to point to Postini. So basically, when you have a Postini account, you'll be given what those MX records are. It will depend on what system on Postini that you're on. And then from within Postini, you can then select where mail is going to be routed to. If you have the standalone version, with the integrated version, it will be routed to Google Apps. If you do have the standalone version, it's a really simple flip. So within an email config, you would just say deliver to Google Apps. You don't have to enter the specific server that it's going to be routed to. You just say deliver to Google Apps, and it will be taken care of for you. So there's a question about how do you set up an EDU domain with a current Google organization account. So if you have a current Google Apps account, if it's standard edition, something of that sort, then you can have that upgraded. There's an upgrade form. I can send that out in an email to everyone who attended. So you can then submit a request for that domain to be upgraded to Education Edition. If you have a Google Apps account, if you don't have a Google Apps account, then you can register by going to, if you go to google.com/a/edu, that will bring you to the Apps for Education page, and then from there you can click on the Sign Up Now or Get Apps for Your School, and from there you'll be able to register for a new Google Apps account. Okay, so there's a question about can current user files be moved over into a new domain? So for current users, I assume you're referring to users who are already in a Google Apps account of some sort, so say a Team Edition account or a Gmail account. So one important thing to take into account, wrong phrasing, one important thing to note is that if you do have users who are on a Team Edition account and you convert this to a education account, then all the users will have the data within their account still. So when you do that conversion, the data is going to remain in Google Apps. So one thing that's important to take into consideration there is if you do want to make changes to that, then you do have to be aware of the fact that you need to tell users that their data is going to be, if you're going to delete those users, for example, because for mail routing purposes, things of that sort for your pilot, you want to make users aware of the fact that you are going to be removing those accounts so that way they can get their data out. If you are talking about migration from, say, a Gmail account, then you can use various tools, and I can send out a link to that information to show how data can be migrated between, say, a consumer Gmail account and a Google Apps account. And then in terms of migrating data, such as docs, things of that sort, users can upload these really easily. They can upload in batches. You can upload your contacts in a CSV format. So if they're able to get this data from your legacy system, if you're talking about that, then that could definitely be done as well. Are there any other questions? Okay, if there aren't any questions, then again, thanks for attending. If you attended the last session, we really appreciate you attending these sessions. And we'll be having another session on Thursday, and so this will be a deep dive into the Google Apps Control Panel. So we'll be taking a look at the Google Apps Control Panel firsthand, some of the useful tips and tricks that can really help you get the most out of your Google Apps experience. So thank you again, and I'll be sending out the information via email when we get this posted onto YouTube, so that way if you want to share it with anyone else at your institution, it's all set and ready to go. Thank you.